Working at a gas station in a semi-rough part of town brought its fair share of unusual encounters. As the clock struck 10 p.m., I activated the magnetic lock on the door. It was a safety measure to ensure that only customers with visible faces could enter the gas station at night. The neighborhood had seen its fair share of petty crimes, and we took every precaution to stay safe. That night, I was tasked with the usual closing duties like checking and managing inventory levels. But I also got the sweet job of cutting and wrapping glazed donuts for the following morning. The faint scent of warm pastries wafted through the air, creating a sweet smell amidst the dimly lit store. As I focused on my task, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. Glancing towards the entrance, I saw a figure approaching. My instincts kicked in as I noticed the hood pulled over their head and hands tucked away in their hoodie pocket. They shuffled towards the door, their heads still lowered, making it impossible to see their face. My stomach lurched as the figure reached the door and tugged on it. The magnetic lock held firm, preventing them from entering. But then, in an eerie move, the figure slowly raised their head, revealing a chilling sight. Their face was completely covered by a dirty fabric with 2 eye holes cut out, and what looked like red candle wax dripping from the eye holes. I felt a surge of panic rise, and I immediately dialed the police while keeping an eye on the intruder. They stood there perfectly still, just staring at me. As I whispered the situation to the dispatcher, I noticed that the figure seemed unfazed by the sight of me on the phone. It was almost as if they knew I was contacting the authorities. Fear gnawed at my insides. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but as the minutes passed, the figure didn't budge. They remained there, staring relentlessly for what felt like an eternity. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, the figure made a chilling move. Slowly, they raised their hand and gave me a small, sinister wave. My heart skipped a beat, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Without breaking eye contact, the figure turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness outside. I let out a shaky breath as they disappeared from sight, but my relief was short-lived. The unsettling encounter left me shaken to the core. The police arrived shortly after, but there was no trace of the masked person. The officers took my statement, but were perplexed by the bizarre nature of the encounter. In the following days, news of the mysterious masked figure spread like wildfire in the community. Rumors and speculations swirled around town, adding an air of mystery and terror to the incident. We'd all graduated and moved into a house on the wrong side of town. One evening I was in my room texting my boyfriend. Suddenly, I heard this noise, a shuffling, scraping sound like someone was dragging furniture on a wooden floor. It was coming from downstairs. Being home alone, I was freaked out. I slowly walked down the stairs, holding my breath, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. I flipped the switch in the living room, but the sound wasn't coming from there. I walked towards the kitchen and the noise became louder, but it seemed like it was coming from underneath the floor. I don't think I've ever been so freaked out. Obviously, I thought about calling the police, but what if it was just a rat? Or worse, what if it was a ghost, or we'd gone and rented a house with a poltergeist? That night I didn't sleep much. The strange sounds continued, sporadic but unsettling. I was too scared to tell anyone about it, scared they'd think I was making things up, or worse, being dramatic. After all, we'd never heard these noises before. The following days, the noises continued. During the day, it was quiet, but at night, it was like the house had a life of its own. One day, I noticed our dog, Max, acting weird. He was always a chill, lazy golden retriever, but he'd suddenly become frantic, barking at the walls, scratching at them even. It was clear that something was off. One afternoon, a week later, my housemates had gone grocery shopping, leaving me alone in the house again with Max. As I was chilling in the living room, a muffled thud came from the wall, then another. I jumped up and Max started barking wildly. As much as I wanted to run out of the house, I decided to investigate, maybe find some evidence or capture something on my phone. I walked into the hall, following the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from behind one of the framed pictures on the wall. I lifted the picture and saw a small hole in the wallpaper, like something had been pushed out from the other side. Holding my breath, I peeled back the wallpaper, and there it was, an actual hole into the wall. Heart racing, I took my phone and used its flashlight to look inside. It was dark, dusty, and full of old wires and insulation. And then, to my horror, I saw a movement. A shadow flickered, and I could make out a figure moving further into the wall. I screamed, dropping my phone into the wall cavity. I ran out of the house and dialed 911 from our friend's house across the street. The police arrived in what felt like forever. I was a blubbering mess, but somehow managed to explain the situation. They searched the house and the crawl space underneath it. It was a while before they came back out, their faces grave. They'd found someone living under our house, a homeless man who'd been getting into the walls through a loose board in the crawl space. He'd been watching us, listening to us. The man had mental health problems, they said, and would be getting help. My housemates arrived home as they were taking him away. I've never seen them look so shocked. We fixed the hole in the wall, the entrance to the crawl space, everything. But the house didn't feel the same anymore. It was a while before I could sleep soundly. Before I could shake off the creepiness of it all. I always wonder how long he was there and what he saw, what he heard. In the end, we moved, but I still check the walls sometimes, just in case. It was 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and I was the only one left in the office. My eyes were burning from staring at lines of code for hours on end. We'd been developing a psychological horror game, something that pushes the boundaries of the genre. Its intention was to mess with players' minds, to leave an imprint long after the game is shut down. Our bosses had been very clear about their expectations. The word crunch lost its initial jarring impact, and it became the new normal. Emails from upper management arrived at odd hours, praising those who were going the extra mile. During weekly team meetings, they'd make it a point to celebrate the employees pulling all-nighters, creating this perverse sense of honor around overwork. You're not just creating a game, you're creating an experience, they'd say, as if that justified the sweat and lifeblood we'd poured into the project. This twisted work ethic has been internalized by everyone. You start to feel guilty for taking a break, for stepping outside, for even thinking about your life beyond the office walls. I couldn't do it anymore. The exhaustion seeped deep into my bones, clouding my thoughts and numbing my emotions. My mental health was in tatters, and it was affecting my mind and body. I pushed my chair back, grabbed my phone and jacket, and headed for the elevator. I looked at my phone battery to see it running on fumes. Not a problem. I'd charge it in the car. Dragging my tired feet to the elevator, I pressed the G button. The doors closed, and I was alone, shrouded in that semi-peaceful, humming quiet only elevators have. I leaned against the wall, feeling the tension in my shoulders. And then the lights went out. Instant darkness. The elevator jolted violently to a stop. "You gotta be kidding me," I mumble, fumbling for my phone. I flick on the flashlight, but even that seems dimmer than usual. Battery at 3%, fantastic. I try mashing the alarm button, but nothing. The entire panel was dead. I send a quick message to the building security, hoping they're still around. But even as I do, I remember it's 2 a.m. on a Sunday. I try ringing my colleagues, but get no answer. I try to calm my breathing. The walls feel like they're closing in. I spent weeks programming claustrophobic scenarios in our game, but experiencing it firsthand is another beast entirely. I'm too exhausted for this, my frustration levels skyrocketing. I text whoever I can think of, but nobody replies. Either they're asleep or my messages aren't getting through. The silence in the elevator starts to intensify, and I'm able to hear my heartbeat. The minutes begin to pass slowly in the darkness. My phone finally dies, plunging me into absolute blackness. There's not a single atom of light in the whole elevator. I look around desperate to lock on to some sort of form. My mind begins to lose it, and I start seeing shapes in the darkness, faces that aren't there. I know I'm alone, but I blindly fumble around checking each wall and corner to reassure myself that these shapes are just my eyes adjusting to the blackness. Time drags onwards as I stare into the dark. I had no way of knowing how long I'd been trapped. Time had lost all meaning. I tried to snap out of my fatigue and started to scream for help. Then I heard it, a sudden thud from the elevator shaft. My body went cold. It was followed by a scraping noise, something skittering above or maybe below. My mind went back to our game, to the psychological tricks we programmed into the experience. But this felt real. I thought maybe it was a rescue team. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to sit down. The cold metal floor bit into my legs, but at least it offered a welcome reprieve from standing. With a resigned sigh, I rested my back against the wall and placed my hands palms down on the floor for support. And then it happened. A swift touch against the back of my hand. Something real breaks through the wall of darkness. My heart leapt into my throat, and I gave an involuntary shriek. My body jerked suddenly and my hand retracted as if burned. Then I heard it, a panicked, high-pitched squeal that morphed into frenzied scratching against the floor. Something was in the elevator with me, and it was on the move. It wasn't just the physical touch that horrified me. It was the sinking feeling that I thought I was alone when I wasn't. My heart pounded hard, my breathing quickened. I cursed myself for all those long nights, coding horror into pixelated characters, never thinking it would seep into my own life, into a real experience that I can't just turn off with a switch. And then it happened again. This time the weight of the touch is slightly more substantial, as if whatever it is has gained confidence. It lingers for a split second before lifting away. I can't contain myself. A strangled scream bursts out of my lips, echoing within the elevator and probably bouncing off its walls into the empty shaft beyond. I swipe my hand through the air, my body convulsing with a mixture of dread and adrenaline. There's a small, almost inaudible squeak, a normal animal sound that should bring relief, but in the context it feels monstrous. My heart continues to race uncontrollably. I am at war with myself, oscillating between an instinctual fear of the unknown and the logical understanding that it's probably just a rat. But logic has no power here. I've been swallowed whole by the kind of horror you can't escape by hitting the pause button or closing a laptop. Finally, after what feels like an age, the emergency lights flicker on. The elevator springs back to life, descending slowly before reaching the ground floor. The door slides open, and I rush out as if chased by every demon ever conceived. It was just supposed to be another babysitting gig, but this was different. It was my first time watching the OBrien twins, Emma and Alicia. They lived in this old creaky house at the end of my street. I was handed a list of rules for their bedtime routine. Nothing unusual, but man, the twins were peculiar. They looked alike, with their pale skin, dark brown hair, and bright blue eyes that always seemed to be looking at something that wasn't there. They were quiet, unnervingly so, and had this way of finishing each other's sentences that gave me the chills. The evening started uneventfully. We watched a movie and they quietly ate their dinner. The quietness was eerie but manageable. As the night went on, the twins' strange behavior started to get weird. They began playing a creepy game, whispering to each other and giggling. Each time I asked what was so funny, they would glance at each other and fall silent, a secretive smile on their faces. I decided to focus on tidying up the mess from dinner. I also did a few other minor chores to keep Mrs. O'Brien sweet. Fed the cat, vacuumed the rug, hoping she'd give a good tip. But then I heard Alicia's voice from the other room. Has she noticed? I asked them again what they were talking about. They giggled and Emma said, "You'll find out." Whilst being really creeped out by this, bedtime came around quickly. I tucked them in their separate rooms, but they insisted on leaving the doors slightly ajar so they could see each other. I retreated downstairs to the living room, settling down to study. The house was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the antique clock. An hour passed and I decided to check on the twins. As I climbed the stairs, I heard more faint whispers. I paused, heart pounding. I peeked into Alicia's room and found it empty. Slightly panicked, I rushed into Emma's room and found them both huddled in a corner, whispering. I asked them again what they were doing, and they both turned to look at me. Those icy blue eyes were emotionless, cold. Alicia smiled. "We're just playing." I put them back in bed and told them it was too late to be playing. Another hour passed in silence until I heard footsteps. I turned to see Emma standing at the foot of the stairs. "Come and play with us," she smiled almost defiantly. I said, "No, Emma, it's too late to play." "Play with us," she shouted as she ran upstairs. I trailed behind her. The house seemed to twist and turn, rooms leading to more rooms and more stairs. I finally caught up to find Alicia in the attic, kneeling by a dirty white sheet. When I asked why they were up there, she just turned to me and said, "We wanted to show you something." A feeling of dread spread through me as they pulled back the white sheet. My breath hitched as I saw the figure underneath. It was their cat, lying lifeless, splayed out on the attic floor. "We were just curious," they murmured simultaneously. "We wanted to see what was inside." Emma stood motionless, her eyes on the lifeless cat, devoid of any emotion. Alicia just nodded, holding out a scalpel towards me. Horrified, I stumbled backwards and made flight down the stairs. I had to get out. I called their mom, who raced back to the house. Needless to say, I didn't get my tip that night. I'm about to do something really stupid. Not one of those regular stupid things like forgetting my car keys or texting my crush when I'm drunk. No, this is epic level stupid. I'm about to rob a gas station. I'm running low on cash, you know, the kind of broke that hurts. Folks at home are struggling and we need the money. Desperate times and all that. I slide the mask down over my face. Funny how a piece of black fabric can make you feel 10 times braver. The neon sign outside's flickering, throwing shadows against the crumbling bricks. It's just me, the crickets, and the soft hum of a midnight road. I step inside. The bell jingles softly. I've got a lead pipe in my pocket, borrowed it from Dad's toolbox. The shelves are lined with packets of chips, rows of soda cans, candy bars, normal stuff. There's a bald guy behind the counter, back turned to me. He's watching something on a crappy old TV and doesn't turn around when I walk in. There's a weird feeling, though, like a cold finger tracing down my spine. Something's not right. He's laughing at the screen, low and throaty. I approach the counter, hands sweaty. I have to do this. "Hey," I croak, my voice barely more than a whisper. He doesn't turn around, just keeps laughing at the TV. That's when I notice the dude's watching static. The screen is just a bunch of black and white dots dancing, and he's laughing like it's the funniest thing in the world. My heart's thudding against my ribcage, louder than a goddamn drum. What the hell? This wasn't part of the plan. I think about bailing, but I can't. I've come this far. I pull out the pipe, the cold steel burning against my sweaty palm. "Give me the cash," I blurt out, pointing the pipe at him. The guy finally turns around and I freeze. His eyes, they're empty. There's no other way to describe it. It's like staring into a deep, dark well. His grin stretches from ear to ear, showing rows of jagged yellow teeth. It's not a friendly grin. He doesn't move, doesn't speak, just grins at me with those empty eyes. It's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It's like he knows something I don't, like he's waiting for me to crack. Then the bell over the door jingles softly. The man's eyes light up as he sees something enter, his decaying grin intensifying. I don't dare turn around. I feel a presence move behind me, but I'm shaking, my whole body trembling. I can't move, can't speak, can't do anything but stare into those empty eyes. The door jingles again. His eyes follow something else moving even closer to me, and I feel the air shift. A gentle exhale on the back of my neck. The bald guy leans over the counter, bringing his face closer to mine. I can see the wrinkles in his skin, smell the stench of his breath. His eyes are still empty, but there's something else in them now. Pity. He makes eye contact with whatever was behind me and shakes his head. I feel the presence behind me back off. Slowly he reaches under the counter, never breaking eye contact. He pulls out a small brown bag and slides it across to me. The bag's heavy, clinking with the sound of coins. It's the money. It's right there within my reach. I should feel relieved, happy even. But all I feel is dread. His gaze is still on me, those empty eyes boring into mine. He hasn't said a word, hasn't moved an inch, just keeps staring at me with that weird, unsettling look. The door slams shut behind me, the bell jingling softly one last time. Whatever was in here has now definitely left. I still dare not look around. I grab the bag, stuff it into my pocket, and run. I run until the gas station's out of sight. I run until my lungs burn. It was after midnight, and Emily and I were driving back from a friend's party. The headlights of my old sedan punctured the darkness of the road. The silence inside the car was thick, disturbed only by the occasional hum of the engine and the sound of Emily's soft breath. We were approaching George's Hill, which we'd driven a handful of times. We'd only been dating a month or so. I thought it time to ask Emily if she'd like to hear the ghost story of George's Hill. She reluctantly said okay, intrigued, but also a little worried. She never liked scary stories. I grinned. Well, George's Hill is not just any hill. It's got a really steep incline, and at the bottom there's a hairpin bend so sharp you'd think the road was built by someone who'd never driven a car. I noticed Emily's eyes narrow slightly, so I continued. Over the years, several people have died there, lost control of their vehicles and crashed. But the creepiest part of it all is the old lady. Emily was visibly spooked, but still wanted to know more about the old lady. I went on, savoring the moment. People say that when you're driving down George's Hill late at night, you might just feel a breath on the back of your neck. When you look in the rearview mirror, you'll see an old woman sitting in your back seat. Once we were descending the hill, I discreetly reached around and lightly rustled Emily's hair. She screamed, her whole body going rigid for a moment before she whirled around to look at the empty back seat. I burst into laughter. But one look at Emily's face told me that I'd crossed a line. Her eyes were wide and her lips were a thin line. "That was not funny, David," she hissed. "Yeah, you're right," I said, my laughter dying down as I realized how much I'd scared her. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that." We drove the rest of the way home in silence. I felt bad, really bad, and it was clear that I'd messed up. Months later, I was returning from a gig with my guitar strapped to the back seat. I'd played a local pub in a neighboring town, and the audience was small, but appreciative. The clock in the dashboard, when it was working, would have shown a time well past midnight. A thick blanket of clouds obscured the moon, rendering the night exceptionally dark. The dashboard was lifeless, a result of a blown fuse I hadn't gotten around to replacing. Speedometer, radio, fuel gauge, everything was unlit, making the drive feel extra dark. I relied on the road signs and my internal sense of speed to navigate through the winding roads. As I approached the turnoff to George's Hill, a memory flashed in my mind. The night I'd scared Emily. We hadn't spoken of it again, but I knew she was still wary when we drove late at night. The guilt resurfaced, and for a moment I considered taking the long route home. But then rationality set in. It was late, I was tired, and I didn't believe in ghost stories. As the car started to climb, each turn and dip of the road became eerily familiar. My headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing fleeting glimpses of roadside trees and fencing. Despite my internal bravado, I felt an indescribable heaviness in the air. I shook my head, chiding myself for letting a silly story get to me. Yet as I crested the hill and began my descent, my palms were sweaty on the steering wheel. Each shadow seemed longer, each noise a bit sharper. I approached the infamous hairpin bend, the apex of so many local legends. I slowed down, easing off the gas pedal as I readied myself for the turn, and that's when I felt it. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the car as though someone had momentarily opened a window. Goosebumps erupted all over my arms, and a chilling breeze touched the back of my neck. My heart started racing, adrenaline surging through my veins. For a moment I felt paralyzed, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. Every cell in my body screamed at me to look in the rearview mirror, but I resisted. The breeze on my neck lingered, and my breaths came out shallow and fast. I knew it was ridiculous. I knew it was just a story, a tale to scare people for the fun of it. Yet here I was, unable to shake the gnawing dread that clenched my stomach. I clenched and unclenched my fists, trying to regain some semblance of control. My mind raced through rational explanations. Maybe the car's ventilation system had malfunctioned. Perhaps it was a draft from a window not closed properly. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, I glanced into the rearview mirror. There she was, the old lady. Just as the legend described. Her face was half hidden in the shadows, but I could make out enough to see her piercing eyes and the thin outline of her mouth. A feeling of pure dread washed over me. Without a second thought, I stomped on the gas pedal. The car roared to life, shooting forward as I practically drifted around the hairpin turn. A slight screech came from beneath the tires, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought I might lose control. But then I was through, tearing down the road at a speed I didn't dare to estimate. I didn't care. I sped on until I reached the well-lit streets of the nearby village. Only then did I dare to look in the rearview mirror again. She was gone. I parked the car on the side of the road, my hands trembling as I switched off the engine. I sat there for a long while, gathering my thoughts and trying to process what had just happened. Could it have been my imagination, fueled by the darkness and the legend itself? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. I never told Emily what happened that night. In fact, I never told anyone. It became my own personal legend, a story I would never tell. From that night on, whenever I had to drive late, I took the long route home. I never drove down George's Hill after dark again. Tonight felt different. It was my first night with Luna, the German shepherd I adopted from the shelter. My friend said a dog would help with my anxiety and loneliness. Being deaf made the darkness more oppressive, filling the quiet with imagined horrors. I thought Luna would be my light, my ears a bridge to the world I couldn't fully sense. I had just finished dinner when Luna began to act strangely. She stood at the edge of the living room, her gaze fixed towards the hall leading to the bedrooms. Her posture was tense, a low growl emanating from her throat. I couldn't hear her, but I felt the vibration through the floor. My heart pounded. Was she growling at a shadow, a bug, or something worse? I mustered the courage to check. Luna followed as I cautiously switched on lights along the way, her eyes still locked on some unseen threat. Each room was empty. I checked closets, looked under beds, even the shower. Nothing. Satisfied but unnerved, I returned to the living room. Luna seemed to relax, and I tried to shake off my heightened fear. But just as I settled on the couch, Luna sprang up again. This time she was more agitated, barking and growling. Her eyes darted towards the kitchen. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone to text my friend Sarah. "Luna is acting weird, barking at nothing. What do I do?" Sarah quickly replied, "She's probably just getting used to the new place. Give her time." But her message did little to calm me. Luna was still on high alert, pacing back and forth between the living room and kitchen. The fear coiled inside me, feeding off Luna's distress. My logical side said it was the new environment, but a deeper primal part of me knew something wasn't right. Gathering every ounce of courage, I decided to investigate again. This time, Luna was more cautious, as if sensing that I was scared too. As we reached the end of the hall, Luna suddenly bolted back, her tail between her legs, and that's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the reflection of a framed picture on the wall. Then the unthinkable happened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the house was plunged into total darkness. In that moment, I felt an isolation like never before. I was awash in an overwhelming void, stripped of the senses that connected me to reality. Luna was my only tether, and I felt her fur bristle against my leg. She was still on high alert, growling at something, at someone. My phone's screen became my only source of light. Frantically, I turned on its flashlight, casting an eerie glow around the room. Luna's eyes reflected the light as she looked toward the hall. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. What was she looking at? I froze. The front door. Had I locked it? Adrenaline surged through me as I rushed to check the front door. Luna was now circling me, barking louder. To my horror, the door was unlocked. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was someone in my house? Had they been there all along, and where were they hiding? Texting Sarah again, I wrote, "Door was unlocked," freaking out. "Luna is still barking." Sarah's reply came almost instantly. "Call the police now." The irony wasn't lost on me. Call the police? I couldn't hear them. I could use the text to 911 feature, but what would I say? That my dog was spooked? It wasn't much to go on. I decided to search every inch of the house, armed with a kitchen knife. Luna led the way, her nose sniffing the air, her eyes constantly scanning. We rechecked every room, each corner, every closet, but found nothing. No signs of intrusion. I was almost ready to chalk it up to my imagination, amplified by Luna's anxious behavior. But then Luna stopped dead in her tracks. She started barking and growling again. This time she was staring intently at the small closet under the stairs, a space I had completely forgotten to check earlier. Luna's posture told me everything. This was different. Her body was rigid, her eyes fixed. I gripped the kitchen knife tightly and approached the closet door. With one hand on the doorknob and Luna by my side, I took a deep breath and flung the door open. There, amidst the boxes of Christmas decorations and old coats, was a man. He was crouched down, almost blending in with the darkness. Our eyes met, and for a split second we both froze in mutual terror. Then Luna lunged forward, barking ferociously, her teeth bared. The man screamed, a sound I couldn't hear but could see in the contortions of his face, and scrambled out of the closet. He pushed past me, knocking me against the wall, and darted for the front door. Luna was right on his heels, snapping at him as he fumbled with the handle. Shaking, I quickly texted 911 to explain what had just occurred. The police came and searched the area. It was a suspected burglary. I can't imagine the outcome if I didn't have Luna to act as my ears. For the first time since moving into that house, despite the close call, despite the lingering adrenaline, I was so grateful for Luna. She had been my ears and my courage. So it was just my big bro and me, stuck at home that day. Yes, school was off the table, both of us sick as dogs. Our house has this semi-finished basement, the sort of place where forgotten furniture goes to die. But there's one room down there that was different. It was our craft room, our own personal playground, where we would lose ourselves in a world of fantasy miniatures. The day had just lazily crept up to the noon mark, and we were right there in the basement, engrossed in creating an epic battle scene, totally in our own zone. Suddenly, we were startled by a sound coming from upstairs. The noise was unmistakable. The front door being unlocked, swung open, and then closed again. Footsteps echoed through the hallway, making their way to the kitchen. The sound of running water as the tap was turned on, followed by the sudden silence when it was shut off. The footsteps continued, ascending the staircase to the second floor. My initial thought was that it must be my stepdad. It made sense since he usually came home for lunch around this time. I hurriedly picked up the phone and dialed my mom's number, eager to let her know that my stepdad had returned. She had just finished speaking to him moments ago and knew that he was still in his office at work. Confused, she called him back immediately, urging him to rush home as soon as possible. Without a second thought, my brother and I hid. We were just two terrified kids in the basement, crouched behind the old furniture, eyes wide, breath held. Our whole house seemed to hum with an intense silence, and all we could do was listen, hope, and wait for help to arrive. Time felt like it was crawling as we waited in tense silence. The minutes stretched on as we waited. We strained our ears, hoping to catch any sounds that would indicate the intruder's presence. Finally, we heard the roar of an engine as my stepdad's car screeched into the driveway. The front door swung open, and we heard his familiar footsteps thundering through the hallway. The sound of his voice, filled with concern and determination, echoed through the house. We heard him combing the rooms to check we were safe. His footsteps creaked throughout the house. Cupboards were flung open, closets were inspected, and every shadow was scrutinized for any sign of the intruder's presence. My brother and I dared not move, clinging to each other as we waited for any indication that the danger had passed. The minutes felt like an eternity, our breaths held in anticipation. Finally, the footsteps ceased, and my stepdad came down to the basement to tell us the house was safe. We released our breaths and emerged from our hiding place. The weirdest thing is that we'd never heard anyone come back down those stairs. And when my stepdad had checked through every corner of the house, it was empty, no trace of anyone. There was no explanation, no logic, just two scared kids in a basement and a mystery that we still haven't solved. We were giddy, both Laura and I, to get out of the house. It had been months since we'd managed to snag a sitter for Max. The kid was a handful, and our regular babysitter had just left town for university. We'd found this new babysitting agency online. They had rave reviews and their babysitters seemed professional. When the babysitter, a girl named Alice, arrived on time, we were relieved. She was petite, polite, had a warm smile, and was good with Max. We welcomed her, gave her the tour and the instructions. Max goes to bed at 8 p.m. sharp. We should be back by 10, I'd told Alice. Enjoy your evening, she'd replied, already engrossed in building a Lego tower with Max. We headed out, a twinge of unease settling in my stomach as I looked back at our house disappearing in the rearview mirror. Laura squeezed my hand, and the rest of the night went by in a blur of good food, wine, and laughter. Our phones were on silent mode, as they usually were during date nights, so when I glanced at it casually 2 hours later, my heart almost stopped. There was a message from the babysitting agency. Apologies for the inconvenience. Unfortunately, Alice had a family emergency and couldn't make it tonight. We are really sorry for this mix-up and will refund your payment. Kindly arrange alternate care for your child. My brain went into overdrive. If Alice wasn't at our house, then who was? We threw money on the table, dashed out of the restaurant, and sped back home. Every possible scenario played out in my mind, and none of them ended well. I thought of Max, alone with a stranger. When we arrived home, everything was quiet. The lights were out. The door was locked. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. As we walked in, we saw the Lego tower still intact on the living room floor. The house was just as we had left it. Alice, or whoever she was, wasn't there anymore. We sprinted upstairs to Max's room. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly opened the door. He was there, asleep, just like he should have been. Relief washed over me. The house was silent, and we spent the rest of the night on high alert. The police did a sweep but found nothing suspicious. Max, blissfully unaware, slept through it all. Whoever was in our house, they had left no trace. We were lucky. It could have ended differently. We learned our lesson that night and decided never to hire from an online agency again. We kept thinking about the woman who came into our home and looked after our child. I still wonder, was she just a random person taking advantage of the situation, or was there a deeper, more sinister motive? I guess we'll never know. We were thrilled to be staying in a charming Airbnb in rural France. This place was so rural that a key under the mat was still acceptable. You'd never get away with this in Chicago. The first 2 days went by like a dream, filled with great food, sightseeing, and relaxation. The house was beautiful, nestled among vineyards and rolling hills. The rooms were tastefully decorated, and everything felt comfortable and welcoming. It was supposed to be a perfect vacation, and up until that point, it had been. On our third night, I woke up with a start. I heard muffled noises coming from downstairs. I looked at the bedside clock, but its screen was blank. The power was out. I strained my ears to make sense of the sounds and realized they were whispers. My heart started to race. My partner stirred beside me. "What's going on?" they asked, noticing my tense posture. "I think I hear people downstairs," I said softly. We both listened. The whispers were accompanied by other sounds, the front door creaking, then the sound of someone fumbling at the back door. We both looked at each other, eyes wide. Someone was trying to get into the house. Our breathing became shallow. We debated whether to call the police, but our phones were charging in the living room. Then we heard it, an internal door opening. It was coming from the direction of the connecting garage. Whoever was outside had found a way in. We heard the intruders dragging something heavy across the floor downstairs. The scraping sound on the wooden flooring made my stomach churn. Then they began ascending the stairs. Each step felt like a drumbeat, heralding something awful. "We need to hide," I whispered, pulling my partner toward the closet. We closed the door behind us as quietly as we could, leaving a small gap to see through. We heard footsteps growing closer, stopping outside our bedroom door. The door handle turned. Our hearts pounded. The door creaked open. 2 figures entered and paused. They seemed to be searching for something. Then they looked directly at the closet. We'd been spotted. In a moment of adrenaline-fueled instinct, I burst out of the closet and lunged at the closest intruder, gripping them by the throat. A struggle broke out, our bodies crashing into furniture, knocking over the bedside lamp. I was fueled by sheer panic, convinced we were fighting for our lives. Just then, the room filled with light. The power was back on. My partner flipped the switch and yelled, "Stop!" In the harsh light, everyone's faces were clear. Confusion reigned. These were not criminals. They were just as shocked as we were. "Who are you? Why are you in our house?" one of the intruders said, still gasping for air after my chokehold. "Your house?" I gasped, still catching my breath. "This is our Airbnb." The 4 of us looked at each other in utter disbelief. It took a few minutes and some shaky conversations to figure out what had happened. It turned out that we were in the wrong house. Our Airbnb was a few houses down, and we had mistakenly entered and made ourselves at home in a house that looked almost identical to the one in the Airbnb photos. These intruders were the actual homeowners, returning from a long weekend trip, puzzled to find their door unlocked and strangers sleeping in their bedroom. They had been equally scared, thinking they were confronting burglars. The dragging noise was them moving a suitcase inside as quietly as possible to not alert the intruders. Us, which explained the dragging sounds. The realization was as shocking as it was humiliating. We gathered our belongings, profusely apologizing for the immense misunderstanding. They were gracious but visibly shaken, as were we. We finally located our actual Airbnb a few doors down and spent the night replaying the events over and over in our heads, grateful that the night had not taken a darker turn. It was a sobering lesson in the importance of double-checking details and a stark reminder that sometimes the most unsettling experiences come not from malevolent intentions, but from a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. And so, in the most awkward way possible, our vacation became memorable, but for all the wrong reasons. I received an unexpected letter in the mail, which turned out to be from the Department of Corrections. As I opened the letter, my heart lurched with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. It was an invitation to revisit Bleakbourne Penitentiary, the abandoned prison where I had once worked as a guard. The letter explained that the prison was being prepared for demolition, and as a former employee, I was being given the opportunity to take one last walk through its eerie halls before they vanished forever. I'd spent a significant part of my life there and wanted to take one last look at the place. As I arrived at the front gates, I was reminded of the sheer scale of the place. Time had definitely taken its toll. It looked really worn and decrepit. From the letter I received, I was under the impression I would be met at the entrance, but when I arrived, I couldn't see anyone around. I assumed everyone was already inside. The heavy iron gates groaned as I pushed them open and made my way inside. The familiar atmosphere that had always haunted the air engulfed me once again. It had been almost 2 decades since I last set foot here. The hallways were dimly lit, with flickering lights casting shadows along the cracked walls. I had no idea why the power was so flaky, but guessed it was to do with the place being so close to demolition. The air smelt dank, and I was worried it would trigger my asthma. They really let this place go downhill. Each step I took reminded me of all the nights I had patrolled these halls. I made my way towards the cell blocks, a place where the stories of the prison's past still lingered. I passed rows upon rows of empty cells, their doors hanging open. I couldn't help but recall the faces of the men I once guarded. As I went deeper into the prison, I could feel a growing sense of unease. I could almost taste the desperation that once clung to this place. A sudden noise jolted me from my thoughts. It was a distant scraping sound, like metal against stone. I figured that it had to be someone from the construction company, or maybe even one of my old work buddies. I followed the noise until I reached the solitary confinement section. The doors to these chambers were solid steel, designed to keep the most dangerous prisoners away from the general population. Yet here I was, facing the cold and imposing entrance to one of the cells. This one I could never forget. This was the cell in which we kept many of the death row inmates before their long walk to the end. I couldn't help myself. I pulled out the old set of keys I had kept as a memento from my time as a guard. My old skeleton key rattled in the lock, and as I turned it, the lock clunked open. I was surprised they hadn't changed them in all these years. Pushing through layers of rust, I heaved open the cell door. The room was shrouded in darkness, and my sense of unease definitely peaked. I stepped inside, the slotted window casting a weak beam of light into the room. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I fumbled for my lighter, managing to ignite it and illuminate the small space around me. Whilst the cell was empty, its walls were covered in cryptic symbols and crude drawings. The flickering light revealed paintings of faces on the walls. Their facial expressions were angry, and I couldn't stop staring at them. I have no idea what it all meant. Then I remembered the rumors and whispers among the guards about the existence of a secret society within the prison, one that delved into the occult and conducted forbidden rituals. The stories had always been dismissed as urban legends, but staring at the paintings before me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more truth to them than anyone had realized. Then a distant voice echoed through the cell block, breaking the silence. Startled, I strained to listen, trying to make out the words. Surely that must be someone from the construction company. In trying to find the source, I quickly ran from the cell and followed the direction of the voice. As the night had drawn in, the darkness had filled the entire prison, making sprinting almost impossible. I remember being really angry and annoyed that the power didn't seem to be working. I could see less and less with each step. and just as I thought I was getting close, the voice grew quieter and less distinct. I stopped to catch my breath, and as I tried to get my bearings, I realized I was in near total darkness, my eyes struggling to adjust. Then from inside the darkness, something whispered in my ear. "It's your turn now." Terrified, I turned and ran. Almost colliding with a wall, I used it to guide me away from the voice. I turned a corner to see a dim light in the distance and went for it. I moved as fast as I could. Finally, I burst through the heavy iron gates of the entrance, the cold night air providing a much-needed relief from the prison. I collapsed onto the ground. I've still no idea if that was someone playing tricks on me or something else entirely I don't even want to think about. I'm an avid traveler, always searching for remote spots to explore. The more remote, the better. So when I found a listing on Airbnb for a cottage set deep in the countryside, it seemed perfect. A quaint little stone building surrounded by rolling hills and meadows, far removed from the noise and chaos of the city. My girlfriend Sarah and I immediately fell in love with the pictures and booked it for a week. The owners, Karen and Jack, met us at the entrance when we arrived. They seemed like lovely people, warm and welcoming. "We're so glad you could come," Karen said, handing us the keys. "If you need anything, we're just down the road." The cottage was even better in person, wooden beams, cozy rooms filled with antique furniture, and a fireplace that added a sense of rustic charm. We spent the first 5 nights relaxing, hiking the trails around the property, and taking trips to the nearby village. Most of all, enjoyed the peace and quiet that only the countryside can provide. Life had never felt so simple and perfect. On the 6th day, Sarah was dusting off a shelf in the bedroom when she froze. "Hey Morgan, come here quick." I walked over and saw her pointing at a small black object nestled between some books. I picked it up and looked at it closely. It was a camera, small but sophisticated. A wave of nausea washed over me. "There must be some explanation," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. We decided to search the rest of the cottage. We found another camera hidden in the potted plant in the living room, one in the bathroom disguised as a nozzle inside an air freshener, and another in the kitchen, camouflaged among the appliances. The feeling of violation was unbearable. I felt foolish, gullible for not realizing sooner that something was off. All the instances where we had enjoyed private moments, conversations, and the comfort of seclusion, someone had been watching us. We decided to confront Karen and Jack, so we drove down the road to where they said their home was located. However, when we arrived, the place looked abandoned, like no one had been there for years. A sense of dread filled the air. We knocked, waited, and knocked again. No answer. We called their phone numbers, but both went straight to voicemail. With a sense of urgency, we went back to the cottage and packed our bags. Before leaving, I took pictures of all the camera locations as evidence. We drove until we reached the nearest town and checked into a hotel. From there, we contacted Airbnb and the local police, providing them with all the information and evidence we had gathered. Airbnb took the listing down immediately and promised a full investigation. Days turned into weeks, and we were back in our home city trying to get back to our normal routine. But the sense of violation lingered, haunting us. Finally, we received an update from the local police. They had gone to inspect the property and found it empty, just as we had. Further investigation revealed that Karen and Jack weren't the owners. The real owners had been traveling abroad for months. Their identities had been stolen, and the property had been listed without their knowledge. The unsettling part is that despite an investigation, they never found Karen and Jack. The bank accounts they used had been set up using false identities, and the photos on the Airbnb listing were a duplicate of the true property listing. They had vanished, leaving us with nothing but a lingering sense of unease. But the one thing that haunts us the most is the fact that whoever Karen and Jack were, they're still out there, perhaps watching someone else in another perfect cottage somewhere. During an ordinary day shift, I found myself doing the monotonous task of tidying up the front of house products, arranging them in neat rows. As I worked, a strange sensation tugged at the corner of my eye. I noticed my coworker standing in the doorway of the dimly lit storage area. She beckoned me forwards to follow her into the back of the store. Kind of intrigued, I set aside my work and trailed behind her, my eyes fixed on her back as she moved ahead of me. She rounded the corner and I called out her name, expecting her to acknowledge me. To my surprise, there was no sign of her. I looked all around the dimly lit storeroom, but she had vanished. I called out her name again. No answer. I couldn't comprehend how she could have disappeared. There was only one entrance into the room. Finally, after a moment of silence, her voice carried through the store from a distant corner, startling me. She clocked in to start her shift and was nowhere near the storeroom as I had initially thought. Instead, she stood at the opposite side of the store, adjacent to the restrooms, a considerable distance away from where I was standing. I couldn't fathom what I was seeing. When I explained what I'd thought I'd seen to my colleague, she semi-taunted me and laughed nervously. I couldn't shake off the feeling, and my co-worker's perplexed expression mirrored my own. Despite our efforts to rationalize the situation, we found no plausible explanation for what had just transpired. The unease lingered. What had I followed into the storeroom? Dispatch, this is Ranger Thompson. I'm going in to look for the missing hiker. Over.
Roger, Ranger Thompson. Proceed with caution. It's dark out there. Over.
I clicked off my radio, adjusted the straps of my backpack, and switched on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trail ahead. With a deep breath, I began my hike into the woods. It was unusually quiet, save for the distant cries of nocturnal animals and the sound of my own footsteps on the leaf-strewn ground. I tried to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. Missing hikers were not uncommon, but this one got my hackles up. The last contact anyone had with him was a frantic call about getting lost as the sun went down. That was 6 hours ago. I reached the point where the hiker was last reported to be, near a clearing with a large boulder. There was no sign of him. My flashlight caught the glint of something metallic on the boulder. Moving closer, I saw that it was a pocket knife, half buried in the soil. I picked it up and turned it over. The initials JD were engraved on the handle. My radio crackled to life.
Thompson, any updates? Over.
I found the missing hiker's knife near the clearing with the large boulder. No sign of him yet. I'm going to keep looking. Over.
Copy that. Be careful. Over.
I ventured deeper into the woods, but soon enough, I started to notice something strange. My flashlight would occasionally illuminate markings on the trees, strips of torn cloth, broken branches arranged in odd patterns. I followed these markers, assuming they'd been left by the missing hiker. But instead of leading me closer to him, they seemed to take me in circles. After the third loop, I found myself back at the clearing with the boulder. Confused and frustrated, I checked my compass. It indicated that I'd been walking in a straight line the whole time. That couldn't be right. I started to question my own judgment, my training, even my sanity. Determined to break the loop, I decided to venture in a different direction. My flashlight's beam darted from tree to tree, always seeming to catch on things that were just ordinary forest elements but looked sinister in the dark, like the twisted form of an old gnarled tree or the way shadows pooled in the underbrush. About a half hour later, I heard it. The snap of a twig. I stopped dead in my tracks, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. Nothing but darkness and trees. My instincts kicked in. I was not alone. Something was stalking me. Another twig snapped, this time from behind me. I wheeled around, my heart pounding. Still nothing. A primal sort of fear started to creep up my spine. I was being hunted. As I stood still, evaluating my options, a low growl broke the silence. My flashlight beam found its source. A bear, standing on its hind legs, eyes reflecting an eerie yellow. I slowly began to back away, my hand reaching for the bear spray on my belt. The bear dropped to all fours and started to circle me, never breaking eye contact. My mind raced through protocols, contingencies, anything that could get me out of this alive. After what felt like an eternity, the bear finally made its move, lunging at me with a roar. I managed to unholster the bear spray and discharge it right into its eyes. The bear howled in agony and confusion, giving me just enough time to turn and run. I sprinted through the forest, not caring about the branches that whipped against my face or the roots that tried to trip me up. My lungs screamed for air, my muscles ached, but I didn't stop until I was sure the bear was no longer following me. Just when I thought I was safe, My flashlight beam fell upon a familiar sight, the large boulder in the clearing. Somehow, despite running in what felt like a straight line away from danger, I had ended up back at the same place again. I felt confused and utterly bewildered. Had I been circling the same spot all night? Was I going mad? My radio crackled, breaking the silence.
Thompson, we found him. The missing hiker is safe. Over.
What? Where? Over?
He was 2 miles south of the trailhead. Injured but alive. Said he set up those markers to guide us to him, but got it all mixed up in his disoriented state. Over.
I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. As I turned to leave the clearing, I heard the bears growl one more time, but it was different, softer, almost curious rather than menacing. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound and caught the bear's eyes again. Only this time the bear wasn't alone. 2 cubs scampered out from behind her. In that moment it all became clear. The bear wasn't stalking me for sport or food. She was protecting her cubs, probably confused and agitated by the scent markers the hiker had left all over the forest. I had intruded into her territory, disoriented in a maze of human error and misunderstanding. Feeling both relieved and humbled, I gave the bear and her cubs a wide berth, making my way out of the woods as the first rays of dawn began to light up the sky. My name is Joel, and I've always been skeptical of the paranormal, but I've experienced something that I just can't explain. It was the summer of 1996 when my friend Derek suggested we go to St. John's Hospital, an abandoned building located on the outskirts of our small town. The hospital had been vacant since the 1980s after a fire led to its closure. Nobody ever bothered to rebuild it, and the decrepit structure was left to decay. The afternoon was hot, and the sun was unrelenting as we made our way towards the hospital. The old brick structure loomed in front of us, its faded paint and broken windows a stark contrast to the verdant foliage around it. The main entrance was boarded up, but Derek knew about a side entrance where the door had rotted off its hinges. We stepped into the stale, musty interior, our footsteps echoing through the silent, empty halls. The building had a layout typical of old hospitals, long winding corridors, numerous rooms on either side, a reception area, and a few larger rooms which could have been operating theaters. Layers of dust covered everything, and decayed medical equipment lay strewn around. Old documents, yellowed with age, were scattered across the floor. There was an oppressive silence, broken only by our occasional whispers and the creaking of the old structure. We spent the first few hours exploring the ground floor. It was uneventful, albeit a bit eerie. We took a break in what appeared to be an old waiting room, the remnants of chairs still in place. As we were resting, I saw a door at the end of the hallway slowly creak open. I pointed it out to Derek, and we both stared at the door, holding our breath. It could have been the wind, but we had felt no breeze that day. We slowly approached the door and peeked inside. It was an ordinary room, much like the others we had seen. The eerie part was it wasn't as dust-covered or deteriorated as the other rooms. In the center was a single hospital bed with rusted bed rails and an old faded mattress. At the foot of the bed was a wooden chair, its paint peeling off, revealing the old wood underneath. We stood there for a moment, taking it in, when a sudden chill washed over us. I looked at Derek and could tell he felt it too. Then we heard it, a low, soft humming sound coming from the corner of the room. It was a lullaby, a soft, sweet melody that seemed to hang in the air. There was no source, no logical explanation, but it was there. Unnerved, we quickly left the room and shut the door behind us. We decided to explore the upper floors, hoping to shake off the strange experience. The upper floors were much the same, decaying with time and riddled with dust and debris. But the further up we went, the colder it got. By the time we reached the top floor, our breaths were visible in the air. It was on the top floor that we found the nursery. The room was full of old, rusted cribs and a few discarded toys. It was as if time had stopped in this room. We explored it silently, our flashlights revealing the abandoned remnants of a time long gone. Then we heard it. A soft, infantile giggle filled the air, echoing around the room. The temperature dropped, and I could see goosebumps appear on Derek's arms. We quickly scanned the room, our flashlights darting around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Yet the giggling continued, growing louder and more unsettling. Derek was the first to bolt, and I was right behind him. We raced down the stairs, taking them two at a time, the eerie sounds from the hospital chasing us. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the outside world, our hearts pounding and our breaths heavy. We looked back at the old building, its silhouette stark against the setting sun. It was silent and still, the sounds of our experience trapped within its walls. I'm still skeptical about the paranormal, but that experience at St. John's Hospital, I can't explain it. It was as real as the dust on those old floors and as haunting as the broken windows. I've never been back there, and I don't think I ever will. You might say I'm scared, and maybe I am, but I'd prefer to call it respect. Respect for whatever it is that remains within the derelict walls of that old hospital. I was 13 at the time. We lived in a quiet neighborhood that was just like any other. Rows of identical houses, neatly trimmed lawns, and SUVs parked in driveways. My parents were going to an out-of-town function that weekend. I insisted on staying home alone. Our house, a medium-sized two-story, was nestled right at the end of the street. I remember the Friday they left. Mom was fussing over food arrangements and emergency numbers. Dad was more chill, reminding me not to throw a house party. As night fell, I sprawled out on the couch, remote in hand, and a greasy pizza box on the coffee table. I had no specific plan, except to bask in my newfound freedom. But at around 1 a.m., as I was dozing off, there was this knock at the front door. I glanced at the security camera feed on my phone. A guy was standing there, his back to the camera. It was weird. I shouted out, "Who is it?" No response. "Hey, who's there?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. A bit on edge, I decided to sneak a peek through the side window. I could make out his outline, tall, wearing a hoodie, hands buried in his pockets. He seemed to be facing the door, just standing there. I was starting to feel really creeped out now. I decided to call my parents, but as the dial tone buzzed in my ear, I glanced back at the door and froze. The guy wasn't there anymore. I hung up and checked the camera feed. Empty. He was gone. Probably some prankster from the school. The rest of the night was uneventful, except for the insomnia refusing to let me sleep. Eventually the morning came, and I spent the day lazing around, assuring my mom on the phone that yes, I had eaten properly, and no, I hadn't broken anything yet. As night fell, a sense of dread enveloped me. I double-checked the locks, reassuring myself that I was safe. Around midnight, just as I was finishing an episode of Stranger Things, the knocking started again. It was the same persistent knock. I pulled up the camera feed. The same guy, same hoodie, standing at the door, his back to the camera. I yelled at him to go away, but he just stood there. I dialed 911 and explained the situation. The operator said a patrol car was on its way. When I looked back at the camera feed, the porch was empty. The police arrived, checked around the house, and found nothing. They said it was likely a prank, but agreed to keep an eye on the neighborhood. I thanked them, feeling a little better. The next day, every single sound in the house made me jump. I kept checking the camera feed obsessively. Night came, and so did the knock, but this time he was early. The knocks echoed through the house. I pulled up the feed, and there he was, looking straight into the camera. Something was very different this time. His hood was down, and my blood ran cold as I saw his face. He had an unnaturally wide grin, almost stretching from ear to ear, exposing unnervingly perfect teeth. It was the way his smile seemed to be almost frozen. I couldn't tell if it was a really convincing mask or if that was his actual face. I remember my parents had this big wall of closets where I thought I could easily hide amongst all their stuff. I pushed myself right to the back and called 911 again. The knocking seemed to reverberate around the house, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I was left there, huddled in the closet. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. It was the police again. They were checking the house but had found no sign of anyone around. I told him I was in my parents' room, and he said to stay put while they checked some more. As I ended the call, I had this nagging feeling that I'd forgotten to lock the back door. I felt sick with worry. Was someone in the house? I strained my ears, listening for any noise. Nothing, just silence. Then suddenly I heard a faint creak, like a door slowly opening. My heart pounded in my chest. Slow, careful footsteps were moving around the room. I clamped a hand over my mouth. The steps got closer until they stopped right outside the closet. I held my breath, praying, pleading for it to be the cops. The door creaked open, and then I heard a soft voice.
"You forgot to lock the back door, kid."
My heart pounded and my ears started ringing, drowning out everything else. I waited, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to open my eyes. The room was empty. There was no scary, smiling man, just nothing. I stumbled out of the closet, my legs shaking beneath me. My phone buzzed again. I could barely pick it up as my hands were shaking so much. Thankfully, it was another call from the officer. "You okay in there, kid?" he asked. I told him I'd heard someone inside the house and that I'd heard him speak to me. I was terrified of every shadow in every corner, expecting the intruder to still be in the house. He told me to stay put again and that he'd come find me. I sunk to the floor, burying my face in my knees. I was a sobbing wreck. Finally, I heard footsteps approaching the room. I looked up to find 2 uniformed officers standing in the doorway. They checked the house but found nothing. I insisted that the intruder had spoken to me and then disappeared. The cops must have come into the house through the back door too, so surely they'd have seen something or someone. The rest of the night was a blur. The officers stayed until my parents got home, explaining what happened. My parents kept glancing over at me with worried eyes. The faceless man never returned after that night. Imagine booking a dream weekend getaway in a floating cabin, luxury, isolation, and the serenity of a secluded lake. Now imagine that dream turning into a nightmare. When Layla found the floating barrel cabin on Airbnb, I thought it was a joke. "You can't be serious," I said, scrolling through the photos of the huge barrel bobbing gently on the calm waters. "It's perfect," she grinned. "An adventure we'll remember forever." The listing described the experience as water glamping. I'd never seen anything like it before. We packed for a weekend away, the excitement of isolation mixed with luxury pulling us in. We arranged to meet the owner, Katie, who was friendly, and our journey started by boarding a small motorized dinghy, which was ours for the weekend. This made the experience feel even more exclusive. "So do you guys have experience on the water?" I shook my head. "Oh," said Katie, looking pensive. "That makes me feel a little nervous," she said. Not wanting to jeopardize the experience, I did what I could to alleviate the owner's fears. "I'm sure it'll be fine. I did lots of kayaking as a kid." "Well, all right, if you're sure," said Katie. "Imagine the stories we'll have," Layla laughed as we motored away from the mainland. We whooped and punched the air as we followed the owners to the cabin in their separate dinghy. Our first sight of the cabin had us in awe. The giant barrel cabin sat by itself, tethered in the middle of the giant lake. We docked the dinghies and Katie showed us round the barrel accommodation. It was compact but furnished in a way that made it feel like a luxury space. The huge barrel shape was connected to a floating platform and was surprisingly well stocked, with an onboard tiki bar, DVD, and TV setup. It even had a gas-powered barbecue. Electricity was through a solar panel setup on the roof. One of the dominant features was the domed window, giving an unobstructed panoramic view of the surrounding lake. The water was still, and in the distance we could hear the sounds of a nearby wildlife sanctuary. Katie gave us a wave as she motored away in the dinghy. With Katie long gone, we both relaxed into our deck chairs, embracing the silence and serenity of the isolated lake cabin. We were totally alone in the wilderness. Nightfall came swiftly, with 1,000 mosquitoes keeping us company. As we barbecued our dinner, we laughed and swatted the mosquitoes away, eventually escaping to the sanctuary inside our cabin. We even made jokes about being surrounded by the local wildlife, making our stay feel even more adventurous. We drank wine and watched a movie on Netflix that I had downloaded onto my phone. We both passed out into a deep sleep until a massive thunderstorm rolled in. Each flash of lightning illuminated our little cabin in stark contrast to the dark. Rain began pelting down, and the water grew choppy. The barrel cabin started to rock. I tried to calm Layla's nerves, insisting that these cabins were built to withstand such weather, But when I noticed a trickle of water coming from the top of the barrel, I realized the storm was maybe more than this floating marvel could handle. As the minutes passed, the trickle became a stream. Our luxury floating cabin was taking on water. Layla's face was pale. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to hide my rising panic. "We're close to the shore. In a worst-case scenario, we can use the dinghy to get back." But the reality was, I had no experience of boating in storms. Also, I didn't want to mention that the wildlife sanctuary was known for having a large number of crocodiles in the water. Swimming definitely wasn't an option. The anxiety was palpable as I started to think about our options. The power suddenly went out, enveloping us in darkness. The water must have got into the electrics. I reached for my torch, shining it around the barrel, looking for anything to stop the water. Layla pointed to the domed window, her voice trembling. "Look." The beam of my torch caught dozens of illuminated eyes surrounding the cabin, reflecting the light with a sinister glow. Crocodiles. Attracted by the storm, they were all around us. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Here we were, in a leaking cabin surrounded by one of the most fearsome predators on the planet. "We need to get to the dinghy," Layla whispered. "What if they're near the dinghy?" I replied, making my voice sound sharper than intended. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Moving slowly, we packed our essentials. The sound of the pouring rain was deafening, masking any sounds the crocs might make. Each time lightning flashed, it illuminated our small cabin, now surrounded by looming shapes in the water. With the cabin slowly taking on water, we took a deep breath and moved towards the dinghy. Holding each other, we tried to make as little noise as possible, our torch our only guide in the pitch black. The boat was a few agonizing meters away. The rain made the deck slippery, and each step felt like an eternity. Layla nearly slipped, but I held her tightly. We finally reached the boat, our hearts pounding. Starting the motor was nerve-wracking. It had a pull-cord starter rope, soaked by the rain. Every time I tried to pull the cord, my hand slipped and the starter petered out. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, always failing to get enough purchase on the cord handle. The crocodiles, sensing movement, started moving towards the boat. But with a roar, the boat's engine came to life and we sped away, the dark shapes slowly disappearing in our wake. We finally reached the mainland, our clothes drenched and our spirits shaken. As we disembarked, Layla looked at me, her eyes wide with relief. "That was too close," she whispered. We called Katie, who came and picked us up and apologized profusely. In hindsight, I can't really blame her for what happened. It was a storm like I had never seen before in my life. Also, she didn't invite the crocodiles to visit. Years have passed since that harrowing experience, but the panic, the fear, and the feeling of being trapped still lingers. We still travel, but now we stay firmly on solid ground. There's something about the stillness of the night that creeps me out, like the quiet is so quiet it's loud, you know? I was babysitting the Lewis kids again, 3 little demons masquerading as adorable children. Their house was ancient, creaking and groaning like an old man stretching after a long nap. They said it had character. I said it had too much. The kids were in bed finally. I had just settled onto the couch, flicking on the TV, wrapping myself in their sofa blanket. All I wanted was a night of binge-watching some old rom-coms. Suddenly the power went out. Great. I groped around for my phone. The feeble flashlight barely lit up the room. The children were sound asleep upstairs. I didn't want to wake them. I decided to go to the basement to check the fuse box, a decision I eventually regretted. The steps were slick with dampness, and honestly, it smelled weird down there, like old, wet newspapers. I'd been down there before, but never alone, never at night. The stillness was so loud, I swear my heartbeat echoed off the walls. I pushed away thoughts of every horror movie I'd ever seen, focusing on finding the fuse box. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, like a shadow slinking away into the dark corners of the room. I felt my heart jump, but I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. After a struggle with the rusty latch, I finally managed to pry open the fuse box. The flashlight showed a cobweb-filled box, but everything seemed in order. I turned the master switch off, then back on. Still nothing. No power. Great. As I turned to head back upstairs, my phone light caught something on the stairwell. I froze. There, blocking my only exit, was a giant spider. Not your everyday garden spider, oh no, this creature was the size of a cat. I'm not even exaggerating. I'd read about these. They were called huntsmen or Goliaths or something. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it was going to burst out of my chest. I was stuck in a basement with a massive spider. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where could I go? There was only one exit, and that was currently being guarded by my 8-legged nightmare. The spider started to move, its bulbous body covered in bristly hairs that reflected the weak light from my phone, its eyes reflecting back at me. Slowly, it crept down one stair, then another, its movements eerily silent. Desperate, I began looking around, my flashlight darting from one corner of the room to the other. My eyes landed on an old broom leaning against the wall. Without a second thought, I lunged for it, gripping the handle tightly. The spider quickened its pace, no doubt sensing my intentions. I brandished the broom, swiping at it with shaky hands, but the creature was surprisingly agile, darting away and then lunging back, its fangs bared. I was not going to be spider food. Drawing on every bit of courage I had, I swung the broom with all my strength, connecting with the spider. The impact sent it reeling, giving me a few precious seconds to scramble up the stairs. I slammed the door behind me, locking it in place. That night of babysitting creeps me out every time I think about it. Organizing my sister's hen do felt like a big responsibility. So, when I found the perfect house, a sprawling historic gem tucked away in the Peak District that could host all 10 of us and surprisingly cheap, I thought I had hit the jackpot. Before making the final arrangements, I reached out to Jonathan, the host, about possibly having a hot tub delivered for the weekend. He declined, citing that the property sat on church grounds and it would be inappropriate. I hadn't known this, but I respected his wishes. When we pulled up to the house, we were stunned by its beauty. It sat isolated in a vast landscape of greenery, rolling hills and picturesque views stretching as far as the eye could see. The interior matched the grandeur of the exterior. Antique chandeliers, original artworks on the walls, intricately carved furniture, and luxurious bedrooms, each with a different theme. Velvet curtains, 4-poster beds, and vintage dressers filled the rooms, and the linens felt as soft as clouds. However, we soon discovered peculiar handwritten notes placed around the house. One note, sitting atop a beautifully patterned cream settee, read, "A grave mistake has been made placing this sofa in this room." On a bathroom mirror, another read, "Reflect on your actions. Water remembers." Yet another in the kitchen strangely advised, "Food prepared here feeds more than the body." I put this down to the owner's weird sense of humor. By evening, the last of our group arrived, and we gathered in the kitchen for welcome drinks. We toasted with Prosecco, momentarily putting aside the weird notes. During the toasts, someone noticed an extension cord running from an outlet in the kitchen, going out through an open window. Intrigued, we decided to follow the cord. It led us to a rusty, ancient-looking caravan parked behind the property. Peering through its windows revealed a disturbing sight. The inside was cluttered with splayed-out taxidermied animals and sharp, rusty tools scattered about. Before we could process what we were seeing, an old man suddenly appeared, causing us to jump. He was dressed bizarrely formal, a waistcoat, cravat, and an old-fashioned pocket watch. He introduced himself as Jonathan. This was the guy who denied the hot tub request before our arrival. With an unsettling calmness, he said he'd be spending the night in the caravan. "Just pretend I'm not here," he added. His demeanor unnerved us. We small-talked for a while and eventually went back inside. Later, as the party went up a few notches, driven by a blend of curiosity and alcohol-induced courage, we ventured deeper into the house. We found a locked door, but it was old, and the lock was easily manipulated. Inside was another unsettling discovery, a taxidermy room. But unlike any we had ever seen, animals were stitched into bizarre, otherworldly configurations. A mouse with the beak of a crow, a deer with multiple heads, each more disturbing than the last. A large crucifix also sat on the wall. We retreated to the living room, laughed a little too loudly, hugged a little too tightly, as if trying to dispel the strange energy surrounding us. We all got blind drunk, and whilst most of the party made it to their beds, I experienced a crazily intense bout of room spin, passing out on the living room sofa. My friends couldn't wake me, so I spent the next few hours drooling on the sofa we weren't supposed to be on. Later that night, I was jolted awake by footsteps. Then came a metallic scraping sound. My heart pounding, I listened as the living room door handle slowly turned. It was Jonathan. I quickly closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. He walked over and stood over me, completely motionless. Time froze. All I could do is listen to his weird, staggered breaths, expelling horribly from his mouth. I silently prayed he would leave me alone. Finally, he turned to leave the room. As he left, I could just make out him sharpening a scalpel on a stone block. I heard his footsteps fade away, and the crunch of gravel told me he had returned to his caravan. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I darted out of the room and woke up my friends, spilling out the events in frantic, hushed tones. My best friend, without a second thought, offered to drive me home. I eagerly agreed. As we navigated the winding roads, my thoughts were a maelstrom of confusion and relief. I knew we had dodged something potentially very dark. We never returned to that house, and we never learned why it was built on church grounds or what those disturbing notes in taxidermy meant. But I did learn something valuable. If a deal seems too good to be true, it almost certainly is. What I'm about to recount might seem like a story spun out of a novel, but every word, every detail is as true as the past that haunts us all. My story is about the now abandoned Miller's Amusement Park, a place that had seen better days in the 1980s. I was only 10 when I first heard the stories. The park was said to be haunted by the spirits of children who lost their lives due to a dangerous ride, the Twister, a roller coaster that had tragically gone off the rails. I remember their names clearly. Alice and Mark, a brother and sister aged 6 and 8 respectively. It was rumored that they still wandered the park, desperately looking for their parents. As an adult, with an interest in the paranormal and a knack for exploring abandoned places, I couldn't resist the lure of the park. So, one night in June 2002, I decided to pay a visit to the infamous Miller's Amusement Park. The park was situated on the outskirts of town, a place shrouded by neglect and a heavy blanket of memories. As I passed through the rusty gates, the moon cast an eerie glow over the deserted park. The outlines of forgotten rides, concession stands, and games booths appeared like ghostly apparitions in the dim light. I navigated my way through the paths, once bustling with excited children and tired parents, now enveloped in silence. My flashlight danced over the remains of the Twister, the ride that had claimed the lives of Alice and Mark. The sight of the skeletal roller coaster stopped me in my tracks. I could almost hear the joyful screams of kids, the whooshing sound of the coaster cars, and the catastrophic crash that had silenced it all. Moving on, I found the old ticket booth, a small wooden structure that had now succumbed to rot and decay. I could picture Alice and Mark's parents buying tickets for their children, their faces beaming with innocent excitement, oblivious of the fate that awaited them. Inside the ticket booth, I found the remnants of an old tattered newspaper. The accident was headline news. It read, "Tragedy struck Miller's Amusement Park yesterday as the Twister roller coaster, usually a source of joy and excitement for countless visitors, suffered a catastrophic malfunction, careening off its tracks with devastating consequences. 2 innocent young lives were tragically lost in the aftermath, leaving an entire community in mourning and raising questions about safety measures. As investigations into the incident unfold, the heart-wrenching guilt of the operator remains an undeniable aspect of this devastating event." I left the booth, and moving onward, I couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that I wasn't alone. I sensed movement in the darkness. I called out, "Hello? Is there someone there?" No answer. As I ventured deeper into the park, I came across a rusted merry-go-round, and it was at that point I felt an odd change in the atmosphere. Out of the corner of my eye, I could just make out 2 small figures standing behind the merry-go-round, staring directly at me, their bodies only just visible in my periphery. I froze in fear, unable to turn my head towards them. Just at the very edge of my hearing, I swear I heard, "Mommy? Daddy?" My blood ran ice cold. As much as I tried to overcome it, I was consumed with fear. Eventually, I managed to engage my head and started to turn towards the figures. As soon as I turned towards them, their figures seemed to fade into the darkness. I stared intently, trying to refocus my eyes, but there was nothing there. I couldn't help but feel their presence was real, but in the desolate atmosphere, was I just imagining this? Had I just spooked myself, or was this actually the ghosts of Alice and Mark still looking for their parents? As the dawn approached, finger-like rays of sunlight stretched themselves across the theme park until the whole place was enveloped with warmth, its strangeness disappearing with the coming light. I left Miller's with a heavy heart, thinking about the final moments of Alice and Mark. Their memory, and the tragedy that befell them, is forever imprinted on the grounds of the park. This story serves as a reminder of their tragic past. Day 1, July 7th, 2018. Arrived in Pripyat this morning. It's quiet and still a ghost town after the disaster. As a field recorder specialist, I've been assigned by a research institute to capture ambient sounds. They want to study the place's auditory ecology, how it has evolved post-disaster, and how nature has retaken the place. It's eerily beautiful here, if one could look past the traces of catastrophe. Day 2, July 8th. Today, I set up microphones around the abandoned amusement park. The Ferris wheel creaked in the wind. My recording equipment, a Sound Devices 633 mixer, and a Neumann KM184 stereo pair, picked up the eerie silence well. Some bird songs, insect noises, the wind against steel. This place is not silent, just a different kind of loud. Day 3, July 9th. Something odd happened today. I was reviewing yesterday's recordings. Amid the natural sounds, there was an anomaly, a low, rhythmic, growling sound, like an animal, but off somehow. The pattern was irregular. It's probably just a large mammal, perhaps a bear. I've noted down the timestamp, 1438, and the GPS coordinates from the location metadata. I'll try to investigate the site tomorrow. Day 4, July 10th. Visited the location from Tuesday. Didn't find anything unusual, no footprints or signs of wildlife. But the unease stayed. It's probably nothing. I'm here to document, not to speculate. Day 5, July 11th. The sound appeared again, this time on a recording from a different site near the hospital. Same low growl. I've cross-checked the time with the previous occurrence. They both happened around 1438. The coincidence is intriguing. I've sent the audio files to the research team for analysis. Day 8, July 14th. The team got back to me today. They're stumped. The sound isn't matching any known wildlife. They suggested it might be an effect of radiation from some animal. The timing, too, the same time every day, seems odd for an animal. I don't know what to make of it. I've decided to be at the site tomorrow around 1438. I want to hear it for myself. This thing has me spooked. Whatever it is, I want to know. Day 10, July 16th. I was at the amusement park again, right at the epicenter of where the sound was captured before. 1438. The wind held its breath. My heart pounded in my chest. Then I heard it. The same low, guttural growl. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I couldn't pinpoint a source. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't vibrate the air around you. I could almost feel each individual oscillation. I was back at my base camp before I knew it. Day 11, July 17th. I didn't sleep last night. I'm a rational person, but I'm also alone in a desolate ghost town. I can't ignore the fear gnawing at me. The growl has changed everything. It's no longer just sounds I'm recording, it's something living. I decided to set up my ambisonics microphone to capture sound in 360 degrees. From the recordings, I will try to triangulate the source of the sound. Day 12, July 18th. I got it. The growl reverberated through the empty town, curling around buildings and trees. It took me hours to triangulate the sound. My conclusion is that it's coming from underneath the ground. I'm actually standing above its source. But what is it? The sound is all I can think about. I've pored over topography and old building plans. There's an old, now forgotten bunker system underneath Pripyat. It's probably flooded and collapsed now, but could that be where the sound is coming from? Day 13, July 19th. I descended into the bunker today. The old steel door creaked open after some persuasion. The air smelled of rust and mold. With my flashlight and recorder, I went down. It was 14:30 when I reached the bottom. Then it started. The growl, so close, so clear. It filled the bunker, resonated off the walls. A vibration moved through the ground, through my feet, up my spine. It was all around me, under me, inside me. Then just as quickly, it stopped. Day 14, July 20th. I left Pripyat today. Whatever it was, I left it behind in that haunted, desolate place. I just hope it stays there. It was just another Friday night. I was working my old school rundown gas station job on the outskirts of Nowheresville, Nebraska. On a good night, I'd probably see like 5 cars. It was the kind of job that my dad used to call character building, but it was mostly just bone-numbingly boring. This Friday was different, though. I had my usual dull shift ahead of me when my friend Pete strolled into the station, looking a bit more sketchy than usual. He whipped out this baggie full of weird, gnarly-looking mushrooms and flashed me a grin that screamed bad decisions. "Dude," he said, "they're magic. You in?" I'd never done drugs or anything, but this shift was boring as hell, and I was curious. What's the worst that could happen, right? I chewed a couple and they tasted like old gym socks. But hey, no pain, no gain. For a while nothing happened, but then things started going sideways. The stale smell of gas became intense, almost sweet, and the flickering fluorescent lights looked like they were dancing. But it wasn't just that. The sounds too, they were off. The hum of the soda machines became a symphony, and the ringing of the cash register sounded like it came from a cathedral bell. Everything was amplified, dialed up to 11. About an hour in, the door chimes rang out like the first notes of Beethoven's Fifth. In walks this tall, shady dude. His eyes were hidden behind dark glasses even though it was midnight. He was wearing a long black coat, like he was trying to be in the Matrix or something. But the weirdest thing was the way he moved, all jerky, like a puppet on a string. He grabbed a six-pack from the cooler, tossed it onto the counter, and said, "I'm robbing you." I laughed. His voice sounded like a rusty hinge and made me think of a cartoon villain. I was tripping balls, and the whole thing felt like some kind of weird dream. "No, for real, give me the money," he said, reaching into his coat. It was a gun. Real life, not shiny like in the movies, but black and oily. And suddenly everything became real serious. He took off his sunglasses to reveal a pair of bloodshot eyes that were bleeding down his face. His hands were elongated and skeletal with long, dirty fingernails that appeared more like claws. Waves of undulating panic kicked in, and everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. The mushroom effects amplified the situation, turning up the terror to extreme levels. I reached for the cash in the register, but fumbled and dropped the cash on the floor. The guy looked confused, then laughed, the gun dropping slightly. For a moment I thought I'd defused the situation, but then he jerked up the gun, face hardening. My heart pounded against my ribs. Right then, a patrol car pulled into the gas station. The dude bolted, leaving his six-pack on the counter. It felt like the world started spinning again at regular speed. The cops followed him, sirens screaming into the night. When the adrenaline faded, I was left standing there, sobered up, heart still beating like a drum. I felt like puking. The magic was gone. I took a deep breath. The smell of gas was just gas again. I never touched magic mushrooms after that. The world's weird enough without them. Dawn broke over the mountains, a gray mist hanging low in the valleys. I looked up from my harness, my fingers aching as I tightened the ropes. My gear was light. I'd done solo climbs before. But this mountain, this isolated peak in the Canadian Rockies, promised a different kind of solitude. No trails, no signs, just me and the jagged cliffs. I scaled the first pitch with ease. The only sounds were my breath and the faint scraping of metal against rock. Hours slid by as I moved up the face of the mountain. The remoteness began to weigh on me, but I was chasing something pure here, a kind of quiet only reachable in places where even the wind holds its breath. Mid-afternoon, I took a break to hydrate. That's when I saw a lone climber on a parallel mountain. his silhouette barely visible against the dark rock. Odd. This area was remote, rarely climbed. I raised my hand in a half-wave, and he did the same. A sense of camaraderie crossed the distance. Then he began shouting something, his voice swallowed by the wind and echoing caverns between us. I squinted, trying to read his lips, his gestures, but it was like decoding a foreign language. His arms flailed in increasingly frantic motions. I stared, confused and a bit alarmed. What was he trying to tell me? Was he in trouble? The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows. I pushed onward, dismissing the climber's antics. The peace I had initially felt was now tainted, its purity disrupted by the distant figure who seemed desperate to communicate something. Suddenly, the sky lit up, bright red and orange, as a flare streaked across the narrow gap between our mountains. It hissed as it flew, landing with a soft thud just above my head. I flinched, my heart pounding. Was this some kind of twisted warning shot? An act of aggression? What was going on? The other climbers' yells grew more desperate, but the words were still a garbled mess, lost in the chasms of air and rock that divided us. I decided to hurry, eager to reach the summit and descend before darkness fell completely. I would navigate away from whatever danger that madman posed. It was me in the mountain. This was supposed to be a sanctuary, not a war zone. Finally, I saw the summit, bathed in the dying embers of sunlight. My body ached, my mind was frayed, but relief washed over me. I was almost there, almost free from whatever threat lurked below. I scaled the last stretch, my hands grasping the top ledge. That's when I heard it, a low growl. I froze, my eyes scanning the summit's plateau. Nothing. I pulled myself up. Another growl, closer this time, echoed from above. My heart sank as my eyes adjusted to the dimming light, making out shapes that shouldn't be there. Wolves. A pack of them, their eyes glowing a soft, malevolent yellow. In that moment I understood the warnings, the flares, the frantic yells from across the abyss. They had been stalking me, using the mountain's shape to mask their approach, coming from above and below. The pack moved closer, their growls deepening, reverberating through the bones of the mountain and into my very core. My options vanished, consumed by the encroaching darkness and the circle of predators closing in. The climber on the other mountain was no longer visible, but his final desperate shouts echoed in my ears. My hand reached for my backpack, desperately feeling around for the flare gun I had packed for emergencies. With a swift, fluid motion, I pulled it out and aimed skyward. The flare shot out, a bright red comet ascending into the gathering dark. It burst in a halo of crimson light illuminating the mountain's summit. The wolves recoiled, yelping and skittering back, their eyes squinted against the sudden blaze. I didn't wait. Clutching my gear, I began the hurried descent down the opposite side of the summit, away from the pack. Each foothold was a gamble, each drop of the rope a prayer muttered through clenched teeth. The flare's light faded, but its glow fractured the night just enough to give me my window of escape. I arrive at Aunt Marie's place on a crisp Monday morning. Her house is miles from civilization, surrounded by dense woods. She's off on holiday, and I volunteered to house sit and look after her cat Whiskey. Working remotely has its perks. The house is older, Victorian in architecture, with creaking wood floors and high ceilings. The first night is uneventful except for the distant sounds of what I assume are raccoons rummaging around. The cat curls up on my lap, seemingly unperturbed. My laptop screen casts a pale light across the room as I work, and I find the atmosphere almost comforting. By the third night, the noises are getting more pronounced. Random bangs reverberate from downstairs or maybe from the walls, it's hard to tell. I look out the window once or twice, but there's only darkness. I decide it must be the house settling or animals outside. It's an old place, drafty, full of quirks. I focus on my work and push any concerns aside. The week passes slowly. I adjust to the nocturnal rustlings and creaks, and the cat seems to be in good spirits. On the final night, I decide to cook a nice dinner for myself. Aunt Marie will be home tomorrow, and I want to leave the place in top condition. I spend extra time cleaning the kitchen, ensuring every dish is put away, every surface wiped down. The silence in the house feels heavier tonight, but I shake it off and make my way to bed. The same unsettling sounds come and go, but by this point I'm too tired to care. I drift off to sleep, lulled by the wind outside. I wake feeling refreshed and excited to return home. I can't wait to sleep in my own bed again. I stretch and head downstairs for a coffee. As I reach the kitchen, I freeze. Every single cupboard is wide open. Pots, pans, and dishes are untouched, just exposed. The silverware drawer is ajar. I stare, unable to comprehend. I approach cautiously and touch the edge of a cupboard door. It's cold, as is the air in the room. I walk through the house, noting nothing else is amiss. The front and back doors are locked from the inside. Windows are shut. There's no sign of intrusion or struggle. I check on Whiskey and she's sleeping soundly on the couch. I return to the kitchen and slowly start closing the cupboard doors. I notice the basement door is ajar, so maybe that's where the cold draft is coming from. I head down the stairs to find a cluttered space with mostly just storage and utilities. I pull the string for the lone light bulb, illuminating a circle on the concrete floor. Everything appears normal. Boxes are undisturbed, old furniture covered in dust sheets. As I'm about to turn and leave, my eye catches something. It's subtle but unmistakable. A single footprint in the dust on the floor, leading away from the stairs. I follow the footprint with my eyes, scanning the dim corners of the basement. The trail stops abruptly, vanishing against the far wall. My skin crawls. I rush back upstairs, lock the basement door, and sit at the kitchen table. My laptop is there, my work, my semblance of normalcy. But the open cupboards have shattered that. The quiet of the house is no longer comforting. Aunt Marie will be back soon. I ponder whether to tell her, but what would I say? I can't explain it, can't rationalize it. I only know that I was not alone in this house. And for the first time, I question what else I've been sharing this space with for the past week. The desert road stretched out in front of us, a barren landscape, only interrupted by the gray of asphalt beneath our tires. We were driving back from visiting relatives in Nevada. My wife glanced at the kids in the rearview mirror, their faces illuminated by the glow of their devices. She asked them if they were hungry. They both nodded, and we agreed we would stop at the next service station. A few more miles passed until we saw a sign for a diner at the next exit. The restaurant stood alone, surrounded by nothing but dust and sky. An old neon sign flickered open. We parked and went in. The bell above the door jingled. A man behind the counter looked up. His eyes lingered on us. He was alone. No other customers, no other staff. Just rows of empty booths and a jukebox that played something half familiar. "We're out of a lot. What can I get you?" His voice was dry, like the air outside. We ordered some simple items that he did have, alongside some sodas for the kids and coffee for us. While he brewed the coffee, the sky outside started to turn. A dust storm was forming. He noticed us staring out of the window. "Storm's coming. Better stay a bit." We sat in a booth sipping the bitter coffee. The man brought over a plate of stale pastries, insisting they were on the house. He sat down at the counter, reading a newspaper but glancing up at us periodically. The storm hit and the wind howled, shaking the diner's windows. Dust particles hit the glass pretty hard, which frightened the kids. Visibility dropped to near zero. We were stuck here for a while. Time dragged. The man started humming to the jukebox, and from the corner of my eye I could see him subtly eyeing us up. I noticed my wife tightened her grip on her coffee cup. We made eye contact with each other, both silently acknowledging the weirdness of the situation. I felt my pulse quicken. The kids seemed uncomfortable, picking up on our tension. I needed the restroom, so I headed down the narrow, dimly lit hallway. A door ajar caught my eye. Inside, I saw stacks of personal belongings. There were tons of bags, wallets, clothes, shoes. I remember thinking it was way too many for one person. Maybe it was donations or a garage sale. That's what I wanted to believe. But something didn't sit right with how strewn they were, or how little they'd been handled with any care. It just didn't feel right. When I returned to my family, I told my wife we should leave. Right now. She agreed. The man looked up. "Leaving so soon? Storm's still out." I forced a smile. "We'll take our chances." "Suit yourself," he said. But his eyes were no longer casual. They were sharp, calculating. We moved quickly, gathering our things and ditching $10 onto the table. The kids sensed the urgency. The man stood up and walked to the door, as if wanting to say goodbye. My eyes met his, and for a moment there was an unspoken understanding. He knew that I knew. The wind still screamed outside, but there was a lull in the dust storm, a small window of visibility. Our chance. I grabbed my wife's hand. Now! We ran out, shielding our faces from the dust and debris. The car was only a few yards away, but it felt like miles. The man stepped out of the diner, shouting something we couldn't hear over the wind. I fumbled with the car keys, my fingers trembling. The car roared to life. I floored the accelerator, tires skidding on gravel before finding grip. We left the diner behind, its neon sign flickering until it was swallowed by the dust storm. We didn't speak much after that. The storm began to dissipate, the dark sky giving way to a twilight. Days later, we saw a news report about a missing family. They'd last been seen at a diner in the desert. Police found the place abandoned, a newspaper still open on the counter. I looked at my wife, she looked at me. We said nothing, but we held our kids a little tighter that night. It was the last run of the day, the sun's light already dwindling. I was with my friends, still high on adrenaline, ready for one final descent. Breaking away from the pack, I spotted a sweet tree run with some untouched powder. I headed straight for it. I glanced back at the piste, to the distant figures of my gang, becoming mere specks against the snow. At first the powder was perfect, a dream for any snowboarder. But then I felt it, the snow beneath me turning treacherous, loose and granular as if turning against me. Before I could adjust, my board caught an edge and sent me sprawling. A miscalculated turn, a slip, and the ground rose to meet me violently. I found myself entangled in a tree well, snow compacting around me like quicksand. Shoulder deep, arms pinned, I was stuck. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind, rapidly overtaking rational thought. My heart pounded erratically, each beat echoing the seconds ticking away. I shouted towards the now distant piste, but the words were swallowed by the snow and the emptiness around me. My frantic wiggling only sank me deeper. I felt like an insect ensnared in a spider's web, helpless and alone. I reached for my phone, but it slipped from my grasp, burying itself somewhere in the snow below. I continued shouting till my voice felt strained. I was stranded and my energy drained, each breath shallower than the last. I genuinely wondered if I would make it out at all. Just when it seemed like hope had gone, I heard an engine's growl in the distance. Relief washed over me like a warm wave. Through the thickening gloom, the silhouette of a piste basher emerged. It was one of those machines used to groom the slopes, its front lights cutting through the dimness like the eyes of a mechanical savior. The machine came to a halt. The driver, clad in a full balaclava and a head torch, climbed down holding a shovel. As he approached, my heart soared. Rescue was within reach. I couldn't see his face, but that didn't matter. Help was here. He gripped the wooden handle of his shovel tightly, but instead of reaching down to help me, he drove the shovel's blade into the snow with a force that was clearly calculated. As I watched from the tree well, expecting a rescue, the man began to shovel heaps of snow onto me. I screamed at the guy to stop. What was he thinking? Why was he doing this? My brain struggled to make sense of it. Was this some sort of sick joke? But there was nothing remotely funny about the weight of snow compressing my chest, making each breath an agonizing struggle. I was being buried alive. My arms were already weakened from efforts to free myself, so fending off the additional weight was impossible. The snow reached my neck, then my mouth, pressing against me like a vice. This was it. I was going to die. That's when I heard the swooshing sound of skis cutting through snow. The man in the balaclava paused, his grip on the shovel tightening. He looked up and saw another skier approaching at breakneck speed. For whatever reasons, the piste basher guy seemed to weigh up his options. He chose to retreat. He dropped the shovel, clambered back onto his machine, and sped away, melting into the darkness. The skier arrived just in time. He dug away the snow covering me, finally freeing my arms. Exhausted but alive, I took in gulps of air, each breath tasting like a second chance at life. Not a word was spoken as he offered me a water bottle and guided me back to the main piste, where my friends had initiated a frantic search. They enveloped me in a group hug, relief visible on their faces. The skier, who I later learned worked at the mountaintop restaurant, reached me just in time. I had been driving for hours through a desolate stretch of highway, nothing but barren fields on either side. The headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, and I felt the weight of isolation settle on me. When the sign for a rest stop appeared, a muted promise of civilization, I decided to pull over. A stiff back and heavy eyelids warranted a break. The rest stop was a simple setup: 4 parking slots, one of which was occupied by a truck, a small building for restrooms, and a couple of picnic tables. The pale glow from the overhead lights gave it an almost eerie quality, amplifying the stillness. There were no sounds, just the distant humming of my idling engine. I got out of the car, stretching my limbs and scanning the surroundings. Nothing moved. The truck that shared the lot looked like it had been there for a while, engine off and cab dark. I shrugged off a vague unease. It was just a rest stop after all. The restroom building was a single structure divided into male and female sections. Pushing open the creaky door to the men's room, I was hit by the stale scent of disinfectant mixed with dampness. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead. I approached the urinal and did my business, avoiding eye contact with my reflection in the tarnished mirror above the sink. As I turned to wash my hands, I noticed something scrawled on the wall beside the mirror. In hurried, almost frantic handwriting, it read, "Don't stay here, he watches from the truck." A chill went through me. I scanned the restroom, now seeing other scribbles that I'd missed. "Leave now. Not safe." Messages etched in varying degrees of urgency, as if over time, yet seemingly by the same hand. I turned off the tap, my hands still wet, and walked briskly back to my car. I got in, locked the doors, and stared at the truck. Nothing moved. Was the warning real? A practical joke, maybe? My gut told me not to linger. I turned the key in the ignition, and my engine roared to life. Just then, the truck's cabin lit up. My eyes met those of the driver through his side mirror. He started his engine. I didn't wait. Foot on the gas, I sped out of the rest stop and back onto the desolate highway. The truck followed, headlights casting elongated shadows on the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. A relentless dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The highway stretched on, a never-ending ribbon flanked by empty fields and punctuated by the occasional road sign. No other cars, no houses, nothing. I pressed harder on the gas, watching the needle climb on the speedometer. The truck kept pace, neither falling behind nor overtaking. I thought of calling the police, but realized my phone had no signal and I was scared to use it at high speed. My mind raced, searching for options. I could either try to outrun the truck or find a way to lose it. A sign appeared ahead announcing a fork in the road. I slowed down slightly, feigning a move to take the right, but at the last second, jerked the wheel left. The truck hesitated, then committed to the right fork. My heart pounded as I floored the accelerator, pushing the car as fast as it would go. I didn't stop till I got home. We were planning a 3-day hiking expedition and hired this guy, Jack, to be our wilderness guide. He was listed on Craigslist, with decades of experience in leading people through the most isolated terrains. When we met at the forest trailhead, his eyes studied us briefly. "This isn't a walk in the park," he warned. Dressed in earth-toned gear, boots that had seen miles, and a hat that hid most of his face, Jack was the epitome of rugged outdoor living. His equipment was minimalistic but functional: machete, compass, and a sturdy backpack that he told us was filled with all you'd ever need to survive. The forest welcomed us with open arms. Giant pine trees loomed over us like guardian spirits. As we walked deeper, a solemn quiet settled over the group. We had left behind the safety of our daily lives, moving farther away from civilization with each step. Jack's initial behavior seemed cordial, professional even, but as the first day wore on, small quirks started to emerge. He would occasionally stop dead in his tracks, looking up at the towering trees or scanning the underbrush. He seemed to be searching for something, though what it was he didn't say. Our first night was spent beside a babbling creek. The fire we built seemed like a futile attempt to keep the encompassing darkness at bay. Jack didn't join us. Instead, he sat a few feet away from the campfire, his eyes fixated on the water's flow, scribbling thoughts into a worn notebook. I ventured to ask what he was writing. "Notes," he said, his eyes not meeting mine. "Always good to keep notes." we awoke to a heavy mist that draped the forest. Jack led us further into the wilderness, moving with an uncanny sense of purpose. As the sun climbed higher, we began to encounter unsettling signs. Clearings with charred wood, like old campfires, but with no paths leading to or from them. The first trap caught us all off guard. A hole dug deep into the earth, camouflaged by leaves and branches. "What's this, Jack?" someone asked. "A deterrent," he replied, so softly we could barely hear him over the wind rustling through the trees. The traps escalated in complexity and cruelty. Snares fashioned from twine, spiked pits filled with sharp stakes, even a makeshift tripwire. They seemed calculated, premeditated, a stark contrast to the untamed wilderness around us. As the day faded into twilight, Jack's behavior took a turn. He would periodically glance at his wristwatch as if waiting for a specific moment. He resumed an unsettling humming, but now it was interspersed with mumbling. When night fell, there was no talk of setting up camp. "We walk," he said, his voice strangely tranquil. As we moved under the cover of darkness, a terrifying scream pierced the air. We all rushed to where the sound originated, flashlights scanning the dense foliage. Nothing. No sign of an animal, no indication of a struggle. Just Jack standing amidst the trees, wearing an unnerving smile. On the third day, it became clear. We were not here for the reasons we thought. Jack seemed more unhinged, his mannerisms increasingly erratic. He led us into a secluded clearing, surrounded by trees so tall they blotted out the sky. "We're all here for a reason," he mumbled, pacing around the circle he had instructed us to form. He unpacked his bag, revealing an assortment of items: a knife, a coil of rope, a flask of murky liquid. He picked each one up in turn, almost reverently, muttering words under his breath that sounded like a mixture of instruction and incantation. He started waving the knife around wildly towards us. He lunged out and cut my buddy across the forearm. There was a mad struggle as we managed to overpower him. There were more of us after all. My pal, Jimmy, was a football player, so he was pretty hench. He butted heads with Jack, sending him to the floor. It gave a momentary pause to get out of there. I ran as fast as I could, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. My lungs were on fire, my vision blurry, but then we stumbled upon an old logging road, overgrown but recognizable. Fueled by a newfound hope, we sprinted along the track, not daring to look back. The hum of my rig's diesel engine was my only companion as I drove through a desolate stretch of interstate. It was the kind of isolation only a long-haul trucker could either love or loathe. My trailer was filled with car parts bound for some dealership warehouse across the country. The dashboard was my ecosystem, cluttered with coffee cups, receipts, and a new dash cam I had installed for safety and insurance purposes. After endless miles of empty road, I reached a trucker park, a barren place consisting of a gravel lot with a few derelict 18-wheelers scattered here and there. No amenities, no Wi-Fi, just a place to park and get some sleep without the interference of highway patrol. Night had fallen, and the sky was a canvas of darkness, dotted only by the faintest stars. I leaned back in my seat, now a makeshift bed, and wrapped myself in a worn-out blanket. I thought about reviewing the dash cam footage from a minor bump I had on the freeway a couple of days ago. The insurance company would need it, but fatigue took over, and in minutes I was asleep, the silence outside enveloping my rig like a shroud. I woke up to the raw light of dawn, a grayish hue that made everything look devoid of life. My eyes felt gritty from lack of proper sleep. I glanced at the dash cam. It was still there, silently recording. With a sigh, I reached for my laptop and connected the dash cam to upload the footage. A file for each day was neatly time-stamped. I clicked on the one corresponding to the minor bump. The footage was mundane, endless stretches of road, sporadic cars, and then the collision. I was about to close the video when I noticed another file. It was time-stamped around 3 a.m., right when I was in deep sleep in this very parking lot. Clicking on it, the footage revealed the interior of my cab. The door opened noiselessly, and a dark figure slithered in like a shadow. My heart turned to ice. They rummaged through my belongings, my wallet, a stack of old receipts, a family photo, and then they picked up my pocket knife. They examined the blade, the edges glinting ominously under the dim dashboard light. They put the knife back carefully and then turned its focus on me, still asleep in the corner of the frame. Their stare lingered as if contemplating some terrible act. Finally, they left, exiting the cab as stealthily as it had entered. The video ended. A wave of dread washed over me. I looked around, scanning the emptiness of the trucker park. I was alone, or so it seemed. I'm driving cross-country through a maze of dark, winding back roads. My eyes dart to the dashboard as the gaslight flickers on. I tense up. I should have stopped at the last town. Just then, my headlights catch a sign. Service station, next exit. The exit leads to an even more desolate road. I remember the tires crunching on gravel as I pull into the station. The station building itself is small, windows tinted and dust-caked. The faded paint and peeling sign make it look as if it's been decades since its last renovation. The attendant emerges, a middle-aged man in a greasy uniform. The name tag says Dave, but it's so tarnished that I can barely make out the letters. He doesn't speak, just nods toward the fuel pump. I roll down my window and hand over my credit card. He swipes it through an ancient card reader and starts pumping gas into my car. The attendant's movements are slow, deliberate. His eyes carefully avoid mine, focusing on the pump as the numbers climb. I glance inside the station through the window. Nothing but a few shelves stocked with motor oil and stale snacks. No other customers, no other employees. I shake my head, dismissing my escalating paranoia. I look at my phone on the passenger seat. No signal. Not unusual considering the location, but it amplifies my discomfort. I tap my fingers on the steering wheel, glancing again at the attendant. He's almost done. The pump clicks and he screws the gas cap back on. "Receipt?" he asks, his voice as flat as the landscape. "No thanks," I said, eager to leave. I take back my card, put the key into the ignition and turn. A brief sputter of the engine, then nothing. I try again. Still nothing. Rolling down the window, I call out to the attendant. "Something's wrong with my car. It won't start." He ambles over with feigned concern. "Mind if I take a look?" He lifts the hood and peeks inside, his face unreadable. "Could be the battery. I'll get a charger." He returns to the station, and I watch him closely. He picks up a jump starter and a walkie-talkie, hooking up the cables to my battery first. Then he speaks quietly into the walkie-talkie. "All set," I hear him say. He returns to my car and unclamps the cables. "Try it now," he suggests. I turn the key, and miraculously the engine roars to life. "Thanks," I mutter, but the relief is fake. "No problem," he says, walking back toward the station. I engage the clutch, ready to accelerate into the night, but the car sputters and dies again. My heart plummets. Something's not right. I grip my phone, still lacking a signal, and pretend to make a call. "Yeah, I'm almost there. Just a small hiccup with the car. See you soon." I speak loud enough for him to hear, hoping to buy some time. I see him pick up the walkie-talkie again, but hesitate, unsure of his next move. Seizing this momentary lapse, I take out a small pocket knife from the glove box. Fingers trembling, I step out and lift the hood again. The battery clamp is loose. I tighten it, praying that's the only issue. I rush back into the driver's seat and try the ignition. The engine sputters but holds. I don't wait. The car lurches forward as I slam the gas pedal. Gravel flies behind me as I peel out of the station, not daring to look back until I've put considerable distance between us. When I finally glance in the rearview mirror, I see him standing there, walkie-talkie in hand. I drive without stopping till the service station is long gone behind me. I've no idea what he had in mind for me, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out.